Okay, since it's right around 7 o'clock, I'll go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our Evenings with Genetics seminar. My name is Pilar Magoulis. I'm a genetic counselor in the Department of Molecular and Human Genetics, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Mr. Dan Riconda. Dan is a certified genetic counselor and associate professor at Baylor College of Medicine here in Houston, Texas, who received his Bachelor of Science in Biochemistry from the State University of New York at Stony Brook in 1985, and his Master's of Science in Genetic Counseling from Sarah Lawrence College in 1988. He obtained certification by the American Board of Medical Genetics in 1990 and became certified as a founding member of the American Board of Genetic Counseling in 1993. Dan is a certified RTS bereavement counselor, and in February 2016, we recruited him and he joined the Department of Molecular and Human Genetics at Baylor and the School of Health Professions to lead the coordination, design, and development of the Masters of Science Genetic Counseling program, and is serving as the program director. And so it's my pleasure to introduce Dan, who's going to be speaking to us today about direct-to-consumer testing.
Thank you, Pilar, and thank you, Susan, and all of the attendees who are taking time out of their Tuesday evening to share perhaps a little bit of a discussion about the merits of direct-to-consumer or DTC genetic testing and what you should know. I do have a few disclaimers. I have no particular conflicts of interest related to the topic we are discussing, and the intent of this presentation is not to coerce, encourage, or discourage individuals who might be contemplating the use of direct-to-consumer genetic testing. I want you to form your own opinions and share your own thoughts as the Q&A portion allows you to do so. Our main objectives for this evening are to provide a basic definition and understanding of what we call DTC or at-home testing. Those are often used interchangeably. And looking at some of the perceived pros and cons of direct-to-consumer testing. I think this slide does a great job at bringing out some of the obvious things that may come out of direct-to-consumer testing. You know, it's important to recognize when someone is contemplating or using DTC, there are some things that may be easily discernible from the tests, and there are some things that may be not so easily discernible. And as this slide suggests, perhaps the obvious information that we can gain are some of our physical characteristics and traits, but there's deeper opportunity and deeper concerns about what we might learn through this type of testing and what those limitations might be. So it's proper to perhaps define some of the terminology, not just direct to consumer, but also what is sometimes called patient-initiated testing as opposed to provider-initiated testing. And traditionally, when an individual is seeking out testing, they often seek the advice of their provider, the individual who will give guidance, recommendation, and ultimately order the test would be provider-initiated testing. And that's what most people are used to. But more and more frequently, we may see individuals who go to their provider and inquire about a particular test, but ultimately is still ordered by the provider. And then lastly, with the direct-to-consumer test, it is a situation where the consumer is driving the ordering and sending of a sample without the involvement of a healthcare provider. There are opportunities to do this through online ordering. There are opportunities to do it through your local pharmacy. Walgreens, CVS offer opportunities for some of the vendors that offer this testing. And in particular, this testing is usually not involving sequencing. The technology that is used for clinical testing to examine and interrogate genetic information at the DNA level, such that you're looking for changes that have significance for healthcare, monitoring, surveillance, perhaps even prevention. Whereas with direct-to-consumer, there is a recreational component, there may be an ancestry component, there may be other circumstances, other information that is gleaned that is not necessarily involving clinical decision-making for healthcare. Certainly some exceptions do exist. It's worth thinking a little bit about how many people are accessing this type of resource, this type of testing. In a study out of MIT back from 2019, it had been estimated at that time that roughly 26 million individuals had already undergone some type of direct-to-consumer genetic test. And it's now suggested that as of this year, it was projected 2 years ago, that greater than 100 million individuals would likely have utilized and accessed some form of at-home genetic test. So the numbers of tests are not confined specifically to genetic testing, and it's worth acknowledging that other direct consumer tests may involve non-genetic testing, looking at certain proteins in an individual's body, looking at toxins in urine, even looking at things like the microbiome, the bacteria that populate our intestinal tract. Are there ways to test these things through direct-to-consumer testing as well? So as we think about the applicability or uses of at-home testing, one of the most common areas in which we might see use or application is in wellness, looking at disease susceptibility or symptoms that may be explained by findings on a genetic test. And stretching the credibility of some of these tests is looking at whether it can predict athletic prowess at a young age based on certain genetic markers. Also looking back at ancestry, which may be something someone wants to know because they are adopted. It may be something someone wants to know because they don't know much about their family's lineage or ethnicity and would like more information. There's also medical applications for carrier testing, things like cystic fibrosis, Tay-Sachs, sickle cell, or other conditions that are known to be inherited. And if I carry it, do I need my partner tested? And what does that have implications for family planning, for screening or testing that may be done on family members? Paternity testing is also an area where direct-to-consumer testing has become a market share, if you will, being able to do testing on individuals to determine whether an individual is the father of a child or an adult for that matter. And then there are physical traits that may be characterized through some of these DTC tests. So the media attention has been fairly substantial over the past decade or so. When this type of testing first became avant-garde, if you will, people would have spit parties and do testing at various laboratories to try to figure out what that might tell them. But many times individuals were going into the testing not necessarily knowing what they're getting. And that is where it would need to be a situation where the consumer needs to do some level of their own investigation and seek out information about what might be the most appropriate type of DTC test that they might want to consider. Some of the key aspects as we differentiate between provider and consumer directed, I've already mentioned or alluded to who is actually ordering or coordinating the testing, but there is differences in regulation. So for example, there are regulatory rules for clinical grade testing, and they need to meet certain specifications based on certification. For example, CLIA, Laboratory Improvement Act, Clinical Laboratory Improvement Act, and CAP, the College of American Pathologists, do quality assurance testing of clinical diagnostic testing, but many of the DTC laboratories do not fall under those regulatory auspices, and the types and methodologies of testing may not be quite as rigorous or giving us the same level or type of information. Oftentimes there are resources within the system to help patients understand the clinical diagnostic testing, whereas DTC, it's often up to the patient, the consumer, to seek out resources rather than have guidance from a healthcare provider in many instances. With clinical testing, it's often examining the entire gene, whereas with the DTC, they're often looking for hotspots, looking for variations in sequence of our genetic material that aren't necessarily cause and effect for disease, but may confer some level of susceptibility or increased risk. And that's an important distinction that is often lost on some and requires explanation as to how they can use the results and what they might gain or what they might not gain from such results. Typically, clinical testing is greater expense, but more likely to have insurance coverage, whereas DTC is less expensive, but unlikely to have any type of insurance coverage. Most clinical tests are done from a diagnostic perspective to tell us yes or no, whereas DTC may or may not have diagnostic components. So I would ask for those of you that would like to participate in the chat or give a thumbs up or thumbs down, do you have opinions about whether, when, or if DTC should be used without medical providers engaged? And if that's the case, do you see a role for medical providers in helping to interpret or to helping foster access to this type of testing? So as we go through this process of discussion, I see that one individual has a fairly strong opinion about it potentially being a waste of time and money, and I think that is a reasonable opinion of these types of tests. And as you ask yourself the following, do you think all genetic tests should be accessible to consumers? Do you think some tests or no tests should be accessible to consumers? And you'll probably find my own personal opinion momentarily, but I'd like to hear others if they want to put it into the chat, if they would pick A, B, or C. So from what I'm seeing, it sounds like the vast majority, if not all, agree that some genetic testing would probably be reasonable, but not all genetic testing, nor no genetic testing. And I think I would be inclined to agree with that statement, but it's also a qualified statement. There may be circumstances where for some individuals, a greater amount of testing may be more appropriate than for other individuals. And that's where the educated consumer, you all, myself, all of us, can make informed decisions about whether to get testing, when to get testing, and when to seek advice in advance or after such testing is done. So historically, patients or even research subjects underwent genetic testing with a clinician involved. Nowadays, there is this opportunity to do essentially what is often referred to as a spit test, where you can basically submit in about 10 to 15 minutes time a sufficient amount of genetic material in your saliva, skin cells that have essentially sloughed off into the spit, send it to a laboratory, have them process it, and within perhaps 3 weeks, plus or minus, have a report sent to you privately that's not part of your medical record, that gives you information. But the question is, what information is it giving you, and what are you going to do with that information? And certainly we can explore some of these questions. So an important distinction that I alluded to a few moments ago is how we're often looking for variations or mutations within disease-causing genes when clinical testing is performed. And these are typically quite rare events. On the other hand, the variations in genetic sequence that we all have between one another are more common. The variations that they're looking for in the DTC types of tests are sometimes referred to as single nucleotide polymorphisms, or you hear the term SNP. And we can literally look at hundreds of thousands of these variations throughout our genome, the 3 billion base pairs, looking at literally 600,000, 1 million of those variations may be able to tell us if we are more susceptible for certain conditions, but they're not necessarily looking for disease-causing changes. There are some exceptions to that. So one way to think about it is you'll hear the term genotyping, looking at variations across the genetic material, but not all variation, and then sequencing, looking at targeted areas in a very thorough interrogation of those regions, looking at an entire gene or a long sequence, whereas the genotyping may be only looking at certain segments or areas where variation is known to coincide with certain susceptibility to certain conditions. So is it accurate? That's a good question to ask. And the answer to that is yes and no. It kind of depends on what component of DTC we're talking about. And it also varies from one company to the next. So it is helpful as a consumer to know what you're getting and to seek out information about those laboratories. But how do you get it? Is it information from the laboratory, which may or may not be biased? Is it information from your friends who have had testing? Is it from your healthcare providers? And what actually is being assessed from a genomic or genetics perspective, and what's not being assessed? Is it informative? Well, the answer again is sort of yes and no. There are some limited applications and utility for some variants, but for many of those variants, they haven't been proven to be reproducible or apply to all populations. Many of the study populations are from a fairly homogeneous Northern European Caucasian study group, if you will, individuals who donated samples. So diversity issues may limit the effectiveness and usefulness of the interpretation of these results, since we may not have as many individuals that have participated in these types of studies in the past to draw conclusions about what these variations may or may not mean. And this is an example of some of the laboratories that do direct-to-consumer testing. Some of them are better known than others, like 23andMe, Ancestry DNA, or Ancestry.com. all of these different providers offer different types of services. Some of the examples of trait testing include looking for male pattern hair loss, looking for things like cheek dimples, whether you are more likely to have this trait, if you will, looking at factors that may influence muscle twitch speed, and by assumption, would that predict greater athletic ability for someone who's a fast twitch muscle as opposed to a slower twitch muscle. Depending on bitter, sour, sweet preferences that may be influenced by genetic factors, that may influence whether someone is more or less likely to like red wines or white wines or dry wines or sweet wines. Whether or not someone is more likely to have red hair, whether they're likely to have a single brow. Some of these things are more recreational and have no real medical benefit, but there are other examples where there may be medical benefit. And the question is whether or not we are doing these things for entertainment or health or both. And it kind of depends on which test you're doing and why you're doing it. So using the example of 23andMe, which is perhaps one of the better known vendors of these services, they have several different domains of reporting. They have the ancestry component, they have genetic health risks, they have wellness, they have carrier status, and have traits. And you can opt in or opt out based on how you consent to the testing at the time of your sample collection prior to submission. So examples of things they can look at on a trait side: bitter taste, earwax type, wellness reports, whether you respond to alcohol consumption with a flush, whether you have lactose intolerance. Now, some of these things are known to be associated with certain ethnic groups. So if I'm of Asian ancestry, I'm more likely to have flush and lactose intolerance, but that is not necessarily universal. But those are things that we may know based on ethnicity without lab testing. On the other hand, if people want to know some of these things that may not be so obvious, like whether I'm a carrier for cystic fibrosis or alpha-1 antitrypsin, cystic fibrosis being a pulmonary condition that's recessive alpha-1 antitrypsin, also affecting the lungs in a vastly different way than cystic fibrosis, and predisposing to emphysema, also a recessive condition. And then there are conditions that occur later in life for which we may be more susceptible, things like Alzheimer's disease, and even single gene tests, where some of the clinical applications for things like BRCA or BRCA1 or 2 may actually give diagnostic components, but have certain limitations. So most of the conditions that we've just alluded to are not due to single gene changes, single variations. So it is worth mentioning that in spite of the statements that are made with regard to yes or no, will I get or do I have a condition, there are some qualifiers to those statements. And it's important to know that when a result comes back from a DTC, you may not be getting the full story, and there may be certain limitations that aren't readily apparent, even if they are providing pre-test and post-test education resources. And more frequently, some of these laboratories are giving access to online training and opportunities. And there are also the ability to download the raw data, something that's not interpreted by the 23andMe or the Ancestry.com, but then use a third-party platform to actually analyze and try to predict if there's other information that wasn't part of my initial report. So if you think about the BRCA1, BRCA2 testing, the BRCA1 and 2, they're actually looking at 3 known changes that are found in Ashkenazi Jewish populations in about 2.5% of that population group. So it is more common there than in the non-Jewish population, where the incidence is about 1 in 400 to 1 in 600 individuals may be carriers without family history. Unfortunately, if I have a strong family history of breast cancer, ovarian cancer, or other cancers that are known to be more common with changes in either of these 2 genes, there are literally thousands, close to 2,000 other changes that aren't interrogated by the DTC test. And if you have a strong family history, this is not a replacement of clinical testing, genetic counseling, and referral for additional information. And that is not necessarily made clear with some of the materials provided by some of the laboratories. So the FDA also has come out with recommendations, and some of the professional societies have come out with recommendations about what to do if you get what is considered a positive result from a DTC test. It's now recommended that any positive result for some of these conditions for which implementation of surveillance or prevention strategies may be appropriate should be confirmed in a CLIA CAP-approved clinical laboratory, which to some extent defeats the purpose. If I'm getting testing done at low cost at this laboratory and something is positive, but I'm not necessarily going to be able to take action on it unless it's confirmed, and that has something to do with the possibility of false negatives as well as false positives, which we'll talk briefly about. So I will admit I actually have done a 23andMe, and some of what you will see will be mine. Some of what you will see will not be mine in the interest of self-disclosure. But the point being, part of my motivation for doing it is because we see patients who have done it. And if I'm going to be informed about what these tests mean to my patients, then I should have some working knowledge of the technology. And there's some qualifiers to what I have consented to do and what you can decline to consent to as a participant in these types of tests. And we can talk a little bit about that as well. So in this particular instance, this result shows that if I were to interpret this test as being mine or anyone else's for that matter, that I was not found to carry the variants for which they did testing. Now, some might interpret that as meaning I'm clear, I'm good, I don't need any further testing. And if that's the case, if they've got a strong family history, that's not necessarily the interpretation that should be taken away from this. So one thing I'd like to share with you is examples of social media discussions and discourse on this type of testing. And in particular, when you look at individuals who have had testing and when they share their experiences, you can see there are some that may be prone to misconception or misunderstanding. For example, an individual who says, here in the States, 23andMe will show you if you are likely to have a BRCA1 or BRCA2. The birth mom, so this was presumably someone who may have been adopted, also had breast cancer caught very early. I don't have the BRCA gene. According to my DNA test, I do go for yearly 3D mammograms. This is an individual that still continues to get surveillance, but based on my read of this interpretation, they're thinking that they're clear, or they may be thinking that. Obviously, this is taken in limited context. And then there are responses that you'll see across social media, some of which are validating, some of which are perhaps contradictory, some of which are more or less informed than others. So additional examples, individuals who might be better informed trying to share their story, but it's not clear that this is the best forum in which to seek out information because you're likely to get contradictory opinions, more and or less informed. But as is mentioned by the bottom left Twitter response, there's over 1,000 variations in BRCA and 23andMe only tests for 3. What's the benefit to the consumer? Certainly the perspective of that individual suggests that this is not very useful to determining this individual's risk unless there are no family history. And even in that context, many individuals have come to us, genetic counselors or other healthcare providers, for guidance as to how to interpret and what to do with this type of testing. So remember, it's not unreasonable to do these tests, but also know what you're getting and what you're not getting using the BRCA 1 and 2 examples. But obviously there are other types of tests that are not necessarily medical management related. So what does all this really mean? Well, there was a study done, published a few years ago in Genetics in Medicine, looking at what apparently proved to be a substantial number of false positive and false negative results. So in the population in which they sent to a clinical lab after a designation was made by a vendor for a DTC, they did not determine specifically in that article which DTCs they were using. There was a reasonable percentage of variants that were actually misclassified, changes that were reported to be concerning, but in reality were not. There were also some that were thought to be present, but on confirmatory testing, they were not present because they actually looked at the mutation itself as opposed to the SNP that may or may not be found in close proximity to the mutation. And that's an important distinction between the SNP-based test and many of the clinical tests that are used for clinical decision-making. So this raw data, this idea of looking at over 600,000 variations in your genetic material out of the 3 billion pieces of DNA, that's an overwhelming task. Well, they have platforms, software applications that can allow you to get a download of your raw data and then input that into an interpretatory resource that looks at this SNP variation. And typically the most frequently used is something called Promethease for a nominal fee, $10, $30. It's not terribly expensive. Individuals who are so inclined can input their raw data to get interpretations for conditions that are not part of the initial screen that were done by a 23andMe or a typical a typical vendor of such services. And they utilize something called Snippypedia, which is a fancy and cute way of referring to a catalog of DNA variations across different regions in the human species. And by taking those associations of variations, not direct measurement of mutations in a particular gene, they may be able to identify individuals who are more likely to carry gene defects even if they weren't interrogating the gene defect itself. So in these situations, and there are other vendors of these types of interpretatory tools, Enlist Genetics, Genetic Genie, some of them are more controversial in their application and in their claims. I'm embarrassed to say that I should never have a slide that has MTHFR on it because there's so much misinformation and misinterpretation about it that I shouldn't encourage testing of it. But that's a personal opinion. Some people swear that MTHFR can tell you everything from Alzheimer's to bleeding to pregnancy risks and anything in between. But it's quite controversial as to whether or not there's actual utility of testing for that particular gene. Switching gears a little bit to ancestry testing, another component of what you might see with DTC. This essentially is looking at individuals based on country or continent of origin. And one of the limitations of these tests, I alluded to earlier, is they're based on what populations have been studied before. And we know that the predominant populations for reference are Northern European Caucasian. So if I'm from a population that is less likely to have contributed to the data sets, the SNPs that have been identified, it's less reliable and less able to identify some of those ancestries or ethnic backgrounds, if you will. And different labs use different markers, so you'll find reporting may not be the same from one lab to the next. Here's a good example of that. On the left is a 23andMe report of the same individual. On the right is a myheritage.com report. And in the middle is the family tree DNA by another laboratory. And what you'll notice is there's inconsistency between the percentages that are reported in each of these three labs. The same person was tested, but the interpretation and percentages are markedly different to some extent, not in all areas, but in many areas. And that reflects the different number and type of SNPs that are being studied in each of the three laboratories. So a colleague of mine, Scott Weissman, actually trademarked this phrase, the entertainome, the idea that many of these tests are not done for clinical application, but for entertainment, for curiosity's sake, if you will, and things like wine preferences may have benefit. Individuals may order wine based on what they believe are their bitter, sweet, sour preferences. Individuals may make exercise and or sports-related decisions based on whether they have fast twitch or slow twitch muscles. Not sure what to do with whether or not you can smell asparagus in your urine, but that is one of the things they can test for, and that would be more inclined with entertainment. So there are some important caveats to all of this. There may be things that we will get that we're not expecting. We may find out that my father is not my father. We may find out information that was not intended to be part of the disclosure process, and actually who has access to my information. Do I have control, or is it anonymized? What are the privacy concerns, and how might that information be used? So to use another example of a comparison between two ancestry labs, this shows very clearly that one lab defined ancestry very differently than another lab. So there are advantages to this. Certainly, it's less expensive to go through a non-provider oriented or ordered test. It may be empowering for those individuals that want this information and feel the need and desire to search for those third-party interpreters, seek out other advice, and it is convenient. It doesn't require going to a doctor's office. You can have the kit mailed to you. The flip side of that is, do you know what you're getting? What are the laboratories offering? What are the standards or guidelines they're functioning under? Do we know whether or not the interpretations across different third-party tools are the same? Obviously, it appears that's not the case universally. Once we have a result, has it been verified, and does it have validity, for what it is telling us it is supposed to be telling us? And as I said, the idea of consumer privacy, am I releasing control of my genetic information? Is it going to cause me to have a response that was unanticipated? If I learned something I wasn't planning on learning about my biological parents, or was I adopted or something like that? Am I going to find out other things that may not have been privy to me prior to doing it? And are people going to test their children without the children's knowledge, or in ways in which they are unable to consent in the testing of minors? So as Macaulay Culkin would say, oh my gosh, sometimes you're not sure what to do with some of this information. This is not aftershave after shaving, but to use a clear example here, an elderly gentleman at 78 years of age had learned that his 2 adult children did not match him genetically. So it wasn't why he did the test. It wasn't his anticipated result, but these were unintended consequences of the testing. And obviously that had profound impact. It rocked his world, so to speak. And now his ex-wife, when confronted, admitted to the past indiscretions. So you can imagine there may be things that can be learned from this technology that may not have been forewarned or foretold. Another example where individuals were found to have a clustering of individuals through looking at communities where maybe 30 or 40 individuals appeared to have the same father. And it was realized through those individuals that all of those individuals were conceived through IVF-related pregnancies. And as a result, it was actually the physician doing the IVF that was using his own sperm. Obviously, that was devastating to the families that had gone through this process, and to learn that through unintended consequences of participating in a study like these types of vendor studies is not necessarily something we would talk about on a routine basis, but it's not necessarily something that would be on the radar of an individual. Perhaps more controversial is how some laboratories release anonymized data, but it's not completely anonymized, and have agreed to help solve cold cases like the Golden State Killer. A not too distant relative who had submitted a sample was found to have certain markers in their genetic material that helped lead them to biological specimens from previous crime scenes where the Golden State Killer had been present, and they were actually able to trace and find that individual through testing of relatives. That's pretty amazing stuff. And when you catch a criminal as a result of this, many would argue that's a great thing. But others would wonder, wait a minute, I didn't give consent to that. And how is it that that information is being released and being used without my knowledge? And there are many other examples where criminal cases have potentially been solved or resolved through this type of DTC application outside of what the original intent was. So there are some things that we should be considering, you all can be considering as possible consumers, wanting to know what are they actually testing for. Not all tests are the same, they're not all equal. How are you going to get results? Will you be given your raw data, and what are you going to do with it? That's for you to decide. Who else has access to it? What are you consenting to? What are you giving permission to? Realize that the cost of these tests, some are as little as $99, $49, $159, or it could be the Christmas gift that your brother, sister, mother, nephew gave you. Once you use this technology, are they going to be able to use it for other reasons? And I'll talk a little bit about that momentarily. And will the company be obligated to contact you when they learn new things? And do you want to be contacted? Do you want disclosure of information after the initial test because of new findings that weren't previously available? Are there going to be providers like genetic counselors or other trained healthcare providers as part of the testing process? Will they refer you? Will you have access to them? Or will that be something that you'll need to be seeking out on your own, and are there additional costs for those services? Is the person who's offering you the testing, if, for example, there was a recent Medicare alert, a fraud alert, where individuals were going to elderly persons with Medicare and telling them to get testing for health screening, and they were submitting for testing for cancer susceptibility, and this was considered deceptive practices, and literally hundreds of millions of dollars in fraudulent billing, which led to the FDA stepping in. That's not a direct consumer application in general, but this was perhaps the misuse of some of these technologies and some of these types of services because of the curiosity and interest that many people have. So as we think about who has access to the information, are these companies that are researchers? Are they not-for-profit, or are they funded? In December of this past year, $81 million in equity investment was pumped into 23andMe. They're doing that because they're expecting a return on their result. Doesn't make it a bad thing, but what is happening with the information in some of these laboratories is they're actually selling information that is anonymized that may help in developing new treatments, that may help in identifying susceptibility to adverse drug reactions, that may help in, even with COVID-19, looking at who's more susceptible. And these things potentially are great applications of the research and technology, but the beneficiary of that research is the laboratory who has your sample, not you. You're not getting access to that, and they're selling that information and making a profit, and that's why investment in private equity has become an area of interest to individuals who are looking to make a buck off genetic information. Again, the difference between phenotyping SNP testing and gene sequencing is an important distinction. Direct-to-consumer test results have variable utility, application or usefulness, and actionability. What are we going to do about it? Can we prevent illness or disease? Can we change behavior? Does it motivate someone to do so? And if a test is in fact positive, what are we going to do with that information? And is it something that has to be confirmed elsewhere? By and large, the answer is yes, for at least the medical genetic testing that's being done, where there may be intervention, screening, or surveillance changes. So these are some of the resources that are available to utilize at your discretion. What I'd like to do is open the opportunity for, through the chat or through individuals who want to open their mic for further discussion on the topic or their own experiences. Certainly you're not obligated to share your own self-disclosures, and we're not doing this to make people feel uncomfortable with the conversation or feel as if they should have an opinion one way or the other. So with that, I appreciate your time and attention and would like to open the floor to any further discussion or questions that may be on your minds.
Thank you so much, Dan. I think I'll kick off the questions. One question I had in your study, and this was a great presentation. I thought you presented it really well, the different nuances and pros and cons of DTC testing. So thank you for that. But did you come across any labs? One of the things that we're doing now in clinical testing is we have the ability to reanalyze data that has been previously negative or non-diagnostic. Are any of the DTC labs doing that? Did you see, and what's their policy on recontacting families or patients if new are identified or new findings are presented or interpreted differently than what they originally reported?
Yeah, great question. It turns out that as the FDA has gotten involved in some of the laboratory testing and disclosure of information, they've expanded beyond just cystic fibrosis, beyond Tay-Sachs. So from time to time, you may get recontacted by the laboratory when they've added a new portfolio to the testing that you already had done. So you have the obligation to opt in and opt out. And a good example of that is the BRCA. When I first did this test a few years ago, it was not part of their reporting process. about a year and a half after I did it, I got an email saying, this is now something you can obtain at no additional charge. That's not always the case. Sometimes as they develop new reanalysis tools, if you will, or expand what they're willing and able to report, there may be additional charge. So it's sort of in the fine print. What are they going to do? What are their obligations? And how do you figure out what they're required to do versus what they're able to do? And again, since this is not clinical testing, it's not like a clinical lab that does something called an exome or a genome, where from time to time, as technology is improved and as knowledge has increased, more people get tested, we may be able to figure out what some of these rare variants mean with greater accuracy. So if 5 people have a variant and we don't really know what it means, it may be a variant of unclear or uncertain significance, sometimes called a VUS. That's not really part of the reporting process for these DTC labs. They're not getting into pushing the boundaries until and unless it's been verified and validated elsewhere. So on the one hand, at least for the limits of the current testing that's being done, there isn't really a formal process of reanalysis or obligation to report, but they're making their own decisions internally as to what they may add, whether it will be part of the pre-existing cost you've incurred or whether there may be additional costs. And one of the things I found is, even though I declined to be a participant in the research component, after I made that declination, I probably got, for the first 6 months, almost an email a week asking me to reconsider if I might want to permit them to use my data in a research study or not. I ultimately made my own choices for or against those things. And you do have the right to decline to participate in certain uses of your information, but you do give up some of your rights by participating in the initial studies. The question is, how far are you comfortable? What are they able to do? And what do they need to disclose to you in that process? So to your question—
It seems somewhat coercive as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's a little bit of pressure there. I've said no. And did you hear me the first time, the second time, the third time, the fourth time, or fifth time? You know, it's okay if you want to ask me again, but enough is enough.
Right. Great, thank you.
Sure. Other questions in the chat or otherwise? I know there are opinions out there. If you're not comfortable sharing them, that's okay. Kevin, you raised your hand. Do you want to unmic and ask a question, or unmute, excuse me?
Yeah, no, Daniel, I really appreciate this. You know, I'm a non-science person. I'm a finance guy, but my brother's a geneticist, and so had a lot of questions about that. So I actually went through two genetics companies, at direct-to-consumer Veritas and Nebula, and did whole genome sequencing, and it was pretty neat. You know, you get some pretty great results back. But you know, I am curious. I know you kind of leaned into this a little bit, but you know, Prometheus and a few of those were actually fascinating, because you actually, you know, I have my full VCF files. I have the, you know, 200 gigabytes of my letters, and it was interesting to actually plug those in, you know, for $12 and get some pretty neat results back that, you know, really gave me some insights to a lot of my autoimmune things that I've been wondering about for a long time, and even some, you know, CF variants on the CFTR gene. And so I guess I'm curious what you think about a layperson like me trying to pretend to be a geneticist and figure some of this out.
You know, just because I have a master's degree in genetic counseling doesn't mean I'm better able to understand information than someone who's an engineer or a finance major. I think we all have to decide what level of in control we want over our own information. And there are concerns on the clinical side: who has access to the information? If I get testing done and I'm found to be susceptible to something, does that affect my ability to obtain health insurance? There is something called GINA, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, which is intended to protect from misuse and abuse of genetic information. On the other hand, when I get a test and I take it to my clinician, it's going to become part of my medical record. So how can I maintain my privacy? But if I'm supposed to take action on it, if I don't share it with my healthcare provider, they're not going to be willing or able to make decisions about management or treatment. So in the broader context, when you have results that you have control over, you also have to ask yourself, if something comes up, how am I going to be able to use that? Am I going to be comfortable applying it in the clinical realm? And is that going to be accepted, or do they now have to go through a clinical lab? And does that defeat the purpose in the first place? Or does it now give me access to something that I didn't have access to before? And why should my doctor control what I do with my information? So those are sort of two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, thank you. Very, very helpful.
Sure.
I will say one thing too is, I look at, there's a difference in generations as well. I'm probably a lot more loosey-goosey with my genome than maybe some others might be. I don't know if you think there's a real downside to doing that, but, me wanting to share it with everybody and actually, have it be part of research studies, to me, I think I'm doing good, but maybe I'm not.
Yeah, I think generationally, you're going to find that seniors are less inclined to be electronically competent. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way. Certainly there are exceptions to that. I know having an older parent and some of the technology difficulties that she's had with the medical record, the electronic medical record, I can't imagine for some people that's overwhelming and they don't have readily available access. And that's where disparities come in. I think one of the dilemmas that we're confronted with is we want to make sure everybody has access if they choose to have access. But the reality is there are barriers to access, financial or otherwise, and or to the resources for the interpretation. It may only be $12 for Promethease, but having access to a laptop or a desktop and getting that information and downloading it may be a barrier that, even though $10 sounds insignificant for some, there are other barriers and other problems with the data, because if we're looking at Northern European Caucasian individuals and we have underrepresented populations for which they might want to use this technology, or is it as reliable for that individual? There was
Thank
a
you very
question
much.
about whether, thank you, you're welcome. There was a question about whether there's a better company. I'm going to avoid answering that definitively and just suggest that it's up to you to decide what you want, what you're looking for. Ask advice of friends and family, and then also ask, what are you going to do with the information when you get it? Obviously, there are big players like the 23andMe, the Ancestry.com, the others that offer different types of services. So some of it depends on what you're looking for. If you're looking for ancestry, if you're looking at wellness, if you're looking at health management, and then if you have family or medical history that actually warrants clinical testing, this is not a replacement. So it's important to know what are your motivations and reasons for wanting to do the testing.
There was another question about if I get tested, am I no longer covered by HIPAA?
Yeah, the health
That
insurance
access or the results in medical record.
Yeah, the Health Insurance Portability and Privacy Act is different than GINA. So I want to make a distinction. We use these acronyms, Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, GINA, and HIPAA, which is a portability and privacy issue. Privacy is something you still have. Someone cannot access your results without your permission. So if it's part of your medical record, you have the right of refusal with some exceptions. If my insurance company is going to pay for it, then they may have a right or a need to access that information. The difference there is not whether or not I can't have my privacy, I can, but what am I going to do with that information and what are others going to do with it? So if I go for an interview for a job and someone declines to give me the job and they actually have genetic information that says I'm susceptible to a particular condition, was I declined that position because of my genetic status, or was I declined that position because I'm not qualified? And GINA intends to prevent it, make it illegal for someone to make hiring and firing decisions based solely on genetic information. And those laws make it illegal, but it doesn't mean it can't or wouldn't happen. It just makes it subject to civil penalties if it did happen. And thankfully, there's not been a lot of abuse, but there have been a few examples. There was a railroad company out west that was one of the first landmark cases with GINA enforcement, where individuals who were applying for an ergonomic repetitive job, a lot of typing, were tested for a condition that made them more prone to problems related to a condition called CMT, Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease, where they were more prone to repetitive injury. And as a result, they were screening individuals without their knowledge and making hiring decisions about whether to hire someone if they had certain genetic markers that made them more prone to those ergonomic injuries. There was a multi-million-dollar settlement. It was one of the first cases that sort of made people aware, certainly employers, that they shouldn't play in that way. They shouldn't use that information. So the protection has been implemented, but there are gaps and loopholes. So for example, if I want to get life insurance, disability insurance, those are not things that are covered under GINA legislation. And if I'm a federal employee or a VA or Indian health insurance, those are not necessarily covered under GINA, although there may be other coverages for those individuals. So this is a little bit tangent to the DTC question, but has relevance for some of these clinically applicable results that may have implications for screening, surveillance, intervention, and might be used in nefarious ways, but thankfully that's not been a common occurrence. A question about being negative for the breast cancer gene and whether someone should or should not get mammograms. Well, about 10% of breast cancer cases are due to an identifiable hereditary predisposition, a single gene that we might have a test for with a high degree of accuracy and reliability. But about 90% of breast cancer cases happen sporadically or happen in ways that we can't trace to a particular gene that you were born with a change in. So on the one hand, because you have background risks for things like breast cancer, 1 in 8 women will develop breast cancer during their lifetime, it is not unreasonable for you to get mammography based on age and family history information, even if genetic testing is negative, because there's more to it than just that genetic test. So those are decisions that should be more informed than by solely a genetic test result, where the utility and effectiveness of that result may vary based on family history, age, and other concerns, and anxiety, as well as ancestry. If you're Ashkenazi Jewish and more likely to have a particular change, then that may influence the interpretation of your results and what to do with those results.
There was another question above about how can, and I think this is a great question, how can DTC companies improve their communication of the limitations and risks in pursuing testing so that consumers can make more informed decisions and have a better understanding of their results?
Thankfully, because these companies are getting pushback on what is happening in the education side, more and more frequently they have online resources. So to use the example of 23andMe, you can actually be prompted to video education, written education, even before you agree to disclose your results to yourself. So getting education is getting better, and then also being the knowledgeable consumer, looking for those resources. Google or other search engines are remarkably useful for finding things, even if you don't necessarily know where to look. And more frequently through social media, individuals are sharing their experiences and the resources that they've identified. So with that being said, I would certainly encourage anyone who has this type of testing done is to do their own homework, to not expect the lab necessarily to do the work for you, although it's great when they do help in that process. And then if you have something you don't understand, seek out advice of someone who can interpret it for you. Or look at that lab to see, do they provide referral? Do they provide resources or post-test follow-up that would help you to get the answers that you're looking for?
There was another question I was trying to help with in the chat, but about minor daughters wanting to know genetic ancestry, but mom is a carrier of a genetic condition and sort of how to handle that. And so I had just commented that if the ancestry testing does not include carrier screening, then that should be able to be done in isolation, but just to carefully review what's actually being tested, or if it's an opt-in or opt-out of certain types of results. And certainly we don't typically recommend carrier screening in minors, since usually carriers don't have any health problems, but it's more so about the reproductive risks for future children that they would be concerned about. And we'd like to wait until they're old enough to understand those implications and to make that decision on their own. But certainly sometimes 16, 17-year-olds, 15-year-olds even might be able to understand that and still would like to pursue carrier screening, for example, if for like muscular dystrophy, if their brother, had muscular dystrophy and they want to know if they're a carrier, something like that.
Yeah, there's a very nuanced approach to how we address this. Some of this is based on best practices and guidelines. So we have our professional organizations that say, unless there's actionable intervention for the minor that will alter health and well-being or prevent or reduce incidence or severity of disease, it's generally not recommended that someone who is not of the age of majority, typically age 18, although there's also things like emancipated minors. If a 14-year-old woman is pregnant, woman, she actually may, in some states, have the ability to make reproductive family planning related decisions because the existence of a pregnancy gives her legal independence for certain decision making. Whether the parents would agree or not depends on the state and other factors, but there's some instances where we may recommend testing of minors if it's a condition like FAP, familial adenomatous polyposis, a dominant disorder that typically shows cancer polyps or polyps and cancer risk that's very, very high, even at young ages. Well, there is a small number of individuals that carry that gene from birth who go on to develop cancers at very young ages. So screening and surveillance for those minors makes it reasonable and justifiable to test a minor. But as the example of cystic fibrosis, which typically is not manifesting in the minor child, you're not really going to use that information to alter screening, surveillance, prevention, but you might use it from a reproductive perspective. So rather than usurping the child's right to make self-determination, and certainly parents have strong opinions about their ability to make those decisions in most arenas, but this is one where medical community fairly well agrees that testing of minors is probably not a good idea because of the emotional, psychological, and limited utility of those tests when done at young ages. And ultimately, courts can sometimes come in to give younger individuals maturity-based decisions. And this is where 17, 16, 15-year-olds who may have an early case of breast cancer in a 20-year-old in their family may be able to be exceptions, but those are sort of handled on a case-by-case basis. Testing of minors is sort of controversial with a few notable examples or exceptions. Any other questions that haven't been addressed either through the chat or otherwise?
If there are no more questions, we're going to put on a QR code for the survey, and we'll also put a link in the chat as well. It was also posted in the beginning of the session. If you could please complete the survey evaluation for today's seminar, that would be wonderful. Laura, do you have your screen, or would you like me to share my screen with the QR code?
I'm unable to get the QR code to work, but I've shared the link again.
Okay.
Would it help if I stop sharing?
Here, I can pull it up. I have it up here. Let me do that. Okay, can everyone see the QR code? Well, hopefully you'll be able to scan it from the screen. And then there's the SurveyMonkey link as well. Thank you so much, Dan. This was, I think, a great topic and really interesting discussion. So thank you to everyone for participating and submitting questions.
So good luck with your spit test if you so choose. Otherwise, it's been a pleasure chatting with you all.
Yes. And please, I think one of the biggest things is, people making decisions off of these results or the lack of a decision in terms of their health care. And so really making sure to speak to someone, either a physician or a genetics provider, genetic counselor, before making any decisions based on your results.
Yeah, this does give you the opportunity to take control of some of your healthcare decision making, but make sure you know what you're getting and what you're not getting and seek out the information as needed.
All right. Have a good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you all.